Hello, I see a Rachel.
Hi.
Hi, Rachel Hunt. If you don't mind, I want to give extra credit to those that get on here. I just have it as Rachel. What's your last name, hon?
Ogunupe is spelled
Mm-hmm.
Ogunupe.
You got it. Thank you for joining. All right. And then I have a Joshua Esteban.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thanks for joining, Joshua. Great, great. And I have a Leah Contreras. All right. Great, great. So, hi guys. I want to welcome you and thank you. And like I said, I want to give you extra credit points for being on here. No one is being docked for not being able to make it. But that, to me, that doesn't preclude my my desire to give extra credit to those who can. Okay. So before we begin with imperialism, that which is on the next test and that which was on your assignment for this week, it's a long subject, isn't it? I apologize, the sections are really long. There's just so much information, and I still feel like what we covered is nowhere near, it's not even close to half of the information that's commonly shared on this topic. But are there any questions before I get going?
I have one question real quick.
Sure.
For me, because I'm the one that has the textbook problem, so I'm not sure when the book is about to come in, but I ordered it, so hopefully by then. But I'll let you know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just remind me in Canvas messages, and I reserve the right in my syllabus to cut people slack under special circumstances. And so if you're late on some of the quizzes, I'll cut you slack on that.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I apologize for the inconvenience.
No, not a problem. Life happens. I get it. And I should have reported it to the bookstore, and we wouldn't have this problem. You guys could have quickly grabbed it from the bookstore. And so I've been terrible at that, just kind of assuming like, well, uh, the only problem with a bookstore for you guys is the book is so much more expensive. They make you get the latest edition and they make you buy it new, and so it's a lot more money than say just buying like a 13th edition used one on Amazon. But okay, so yeah, not a problem, Josh. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this material, okay? So notice what number 1 on your argumentative assignment is. Number 1, and as well as let's see here, as number 2 are court history, because the fact of the matter is, remember, court history, it praises and it justifies the winners, right? And in particular, like presidents and administrations. And so we can't deny that we took over several islands. We took Puerto Rico. We were in Cuba for 4 years at the end of the Spanish-American War from 1898 to 1902. We took the Philippines, and we're going to keep them until the end of World War II. And so we can't deny that, right? And so we can't deny the fact that we became an overseas imperialist. And imperialism in academia, that's definitely a bad word. It's synonymous with being a bully, right? Imposing your will on another separate sovereign land and people, oftentimes against their will or irrespective of their desire. And so we can't deny that. So the best thing court history can do is say either that we were pushed into it, right? That we were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into becoming an imperialist power. So we were hesitant about it, not like a typical bully, or that we firmly, truly believed, right? We had a series of belief systems and ideologies that were going out at that time that made us convinced that imperialism was a necessity, right? That as if we felt as if there were no choice. We had to become more aggressive overseas. And that's the heart of numbers 1 and 2. Should you choose either or both of those? Okay. So with number 1, right, I try to get into the fact that I try to make a couple arguments. One is that the ideas that were percolating at this time were dangerous in their consequences, in their ramifications, right? So I mentioned Nietzsche, right? Friedrich Nietzsche, and the fact that the fascist Germany is going to quote much of his works, etc., and saying that and being a social Darwinist and thinking that the weak are meant to die out, right? And there should be just this new man ought to come from this softened, effeminate generation that he was living in the Gilded Age at the end of the 1800s, and that there needs to be a brave new race of people. He called it the Ubermensch, the Superman people, right? Whereby they would not be confined to old Judeo-Christian notions of mercy and pity and compassion and turning the other cheek, but that they would disregard that value system, which he called a slave morality, the morality of slaves rather than masters, and that they should adhere to just to more to their animal instincts, right? I mentioned social Darwinists, Spencer and Huxley, and them applying Darwin's laws of um, of survival of the fittest, right, to societies, and claiming that no less so than in nature, that societal changes and environmental and historical circumstances are hostile to nations' existence, and they must adapt. They must always progressively look to that which is progressive and forward-looking, and that they should militarize and become powerful, etc., or else they're going to die out, right? And there were the notions at the direction of the late 1800s. They felt like urbanization, industrialization, commerce or trade spreading from regions to different nations and global dimensions, that was the way of the future. So hence, if you were a quote primitive people and didn't embrace these changes, that you likely were going to die out. You were going to get gobbled up by a bigger nation, more industrialized nation, right? So then along with that, you even had some Christian groups that embraced this, like Josiah Strong, and stating that, well, that is the way that it has been since the fall of Adam and Eve, that's our curse that's humanity's curse for sin, and that is the way that things are. And so why not only progress and change and militarize and so forth, right, and become modernized, but why not also even uplift certain people, certain civilizations and countries that are likely doomed to extinction, that even though they don't want your help, it's in their best interest to be caught up to speed with that which entails modernity, right? So hence, when we went to the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, but especially the Philippines, I would say, we gave them public school systems. We gave them water and sewage systems and sanitation brigades. We gave them modern inoculations or vaccines to diseases that supposedly for their own good, telegraph wires and electricity and running water, etc., right? And we helped them build up a more modernized military, etc. And so hence it was for their own good. You had people like Chamberlain, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Lacombe de Gobineau, and others who contended that life was about a fight for survival and extinction between races. And of course, we don't use that category anymore, but it was very in vogue at that time. And so there was the white Aryan or Caucasian race, and of course, they contended that not only had they modernized and become more progressive, but they even tried to put Darwinism involved in it, right? And say that they had come from the Neanderthals or they had evolved further from the simian or primate stage. And so that there were actually a difference of species between different races, which is ridiculous now, but this was science at that time, right? And it was accepted in Cambridge and our Ivy League schools here in the US, and that they took this stuff seriously, right? And then I want to also add Alfred Thayer Mahan, Mahan. Mahan. Oh, and then actually, I lied. I'm going to do two. Another one was Frederick Jackson Turner. He stated, right, that remember we did this with the West, that the West renewed American meritocracy. He also claimed that the West was a safety valve, that those who didn't have a chance of socioeconomic ascension or the American dream in the East, they were just a rebellion waiting to happen. And so it was good that there was a new Western frontier for them to move to and to chase their American dream there. And so that when there were pent up energy, there was pent up energy, pent up resources, too many people, population wise, right? Remember, Malthus was worried about too many people on the earth and not enough resources, and they were going to fight over scarce resources. Turner said that the West was a safety valve that kept us from rebellion. So people moved to the West and chased their dreams there, right? And commerce was just booming. There were markets that needed to buy all the mass-produced goods, and the West provided that. But he stated that in his paper in 1492 and 1892 and 1893, it was largely discussed from his paper that the West had been colonized, that the West now was no longer an open frontier, that most of its resources and land had been claimed and dominated. And so now what do we do with the surplus goods and products that we have? What exacerbated this or made it worse was the depression, economic depression we had of 1893, which was arguably the worst we had had up to that time. So people were thinking, oh my goodness, now what do? We have no more of a safety valve. We have we don't have enough markets to buy all the goods, etc. Right? So people started arguing, we need to look overseas. We need to look elsewhere to solve and resolve these problems. Okay. And so Mahan, going back to him, he had a lot of political connections. He literally gave his book out to all the members of the Senate, the leaders of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We have primary source quotes from them that they were heavily influenced by his message in his book. And his Influence of Sea Power book, he makes the argument, right, that he incorporates all the ideas that we just mentioned and said that America's best quest for survival and for striving and surviving and thriving in the future lay overseas. And they call it geopolitics, right? Where geographically you look at a map and you deal with the what ifs of warfare and say, okay, what if we're attacked by Germany? What if we're attacked by rising Japan, etc., right? And you look at the Pacific Ocean, you look at the Caribbean Ocean, and you determine what places have geopolitical significance. That, okay, as long as we have control of this area in the Pacific Ocean, we'll be safe from an invasion, from an attack from Japan, etc., right? And so, but the problem is in trying to gain influence over these islands in the middle of the Pacific, between us and Asia, for instance, right? Or in the Caribbean, that's kind of considered our front porch, if you will, is that you don't take no for an answer. So you try to cut deals with these island nations and say, okay, we'll offer you. Oftentimes it involved economics, some type of economic opportunities, right? In return for allowing us to have a naval station here. So in case there's a war, we're ready, right? Or we'll say, okay, we want you to only provide coal to us and not our possible future enemies. And coal, remember, was fuel for that time. They burnt coal in the steam engines to propel the ships. So it was like an AM/PM gas stop. And so hence we said to the Samoan Islands, for instance, right, in the middle of the Pacific, we want you to only provide coal for us. And if grudgingly for anyone else, they have to pay a special high tax because we want that advantage in the middle of the Pacific. And when the Samoan government was hesitant to do so, then we resorted to extortion. We would say, all right, if you don't, and we would make one threat or another upon them. So you don't take no for an answer sometimes in geopolitics. and that has been um, unapologetically called 100 years later realpolitik, as I put in the writing, italicized. Realpolitik is that you unabashedly seek your own country's best interest, even if it's at the expense of other smaller nations, right? And so, at any rate, with all these ideas percolating, I'm saying in number one, we supposedly felt compelled to get aggressive, okay? And then with number two, I try to provide evidence of a great man history, first a President Cleveland, then a President McKinley after him in the 1890s, whereby they had plenty of opportunities and excuses and even pressure to get involved in the Spanish-Cuban Wars, right? Cuba's just 90 miles off of the Florida coast. We had 35 to $50 million worth of Americans' money invested in that island. We had thousands of dual citizens who were citizens of Cuba and citizens of the United States simultaneously. And Cuba tried in the 1870s to no avail, and then tried again in 1895 to fight for its independence from Spain, right? And so you should find evidence in these, and number two, of plenty of pressure being placed upon the president to get involved on behalf of the Cuban freedom movement, the Cuba Libre movement, and fight the Spanish for and with them and let them gain their independence. Now, in our defense, it was declared by Congress and it was issued as an edict by both presidents that they had no interest in taking Cuba and like for good as like a colony of any sort. But nevertheless, right, we're going to in 1898 get involved and fight with the Cubans, right, against the Spanish. And we're going to stay there for 4 years until we finally got out. And even when we did get out in 1902, we reserved the right to intervene in Cuba when we declared to be necessary. And we also declared that we had the right to keep a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, whether the Cubans wanted it or not. So very paternalistic, right? Like we're the parent and the Cubans are the children, and it's for their own good that we're going to help bring them up to speed to modernity. And we're going to reserve the right to intervene. And of course, ostensibly, what was the main reason we claimed we had a right to intervene? It was always the same things. It was either to protect life, liberty, or property of dual citizens, right? Because remember, the 5th and 14th Amendment state that American citizens' lives, liberty, and property are to be guaranteed and protected by the federal government. But does that mean overseas? It doesn't stipulate. So different administrations have interpreted it differently, right? And so in this more aggressive time period, our administrations determined that that did include American citizens abroad, okay? So that was one excuse by which we declared the right to intervene in Cuba and in other transoceanic island countries. But secondly, it was for stability. And this is much more controversial, right? Because this has no constitutional grounding beneath it. And the idea is that two things is, for one, business. Business usually thrives, right, in peacetime. If a country is not ridden with war and revolutions and coups, etc., businessmen are more apt to invest in business in those islands, right? So we contended that we needed stability for American commerce or trade to work better. And then secondly, right, is geopolitics, as we contended that when there's restlessness and when there is chaos in an island country, it historically has invited a European power to come in during that vulnerable time for the island and bully its way into their institutions in one way or another, formally or informally. So at any rate, going back to number two, is I tried to give the court interpretation of Cleveland, stay in discipline, and no problem, Josh. uh, President Cleveland staying out of that issue. Because remember, at a place called Galeon in Cuba, the Cuban rebels actually have primary source evidence for this, is they would engage in scorched earth policy. If they knew a region was loyal to Spain instead of to the Free Cuba movement in their own country, on their own island, they would burn their plantations punitively to the ground and also see to it that the Spanish couldn't use the resources in that area. And the Spanish did the same. They would burn fields and punish and take away the property of those who had harbored the Cuban rebels. And so at El Galeon, it was even mentioned by the Cuban rebels that if and when they burn property of dual citizens, it might help drag America into the war to help them, because it was kind of a David versus Goliath movement, right? The small Cuban nation fighting against big Spain to kick her out. So there's even evidence of some of the Cuban rebels trying to pull us in to fight with and for them to help them gain their independence. Okay, so those are numbers 1 and 2. Then I turn more to revisionist history on 3 and 4, right? Look for evidence of number 3 of America unapologetically engaging in realpolitik or geopolitics, aggressively, unapologetically seeking our own self-interest, even and oftentimes at the expense of what was best for the people in those small countries, right? And so look for evidence of that in number 3, and how we began acting like a European imperialist bully and imposing our will and intervening in the internal domestic affairs of these Caribbean islands and Pacific islands. Okay. And then number 4, McKinley, as I state, right, was a puzzle of a man. He was an enigma. He was an apparent contradiction in many ways, a paradox. He, on the one hand, as you see in number 2, there's evidence that he was very hesitant to get involved in the war. But once he does, right, he says, okay, we're going to fight the Spanish also in Puerto Rico and in the Philippines. Well, in the Philippines, they were very hesitant. They had I'm probably going to mispronunciate this, but the Katipunan, the organization of rebels under Emilio Aguinaldo and others in the Philippines, they didn't necessarily ask nor invite us to help them in fighting for their independence from Spain. But President McKinley decided to go help them nonetheless. In Puerto Rico, what Spain decided to offer a compromise to these island countries and say you could have, quote, autonomy. And it's a little bit of a misnomer, because to me, autonomy means independence, but that's not what Spain meant. They meant that you could have your own elected representative government concerning everything domestic in your policies in your home island, but we will still run your military and we will still dictate your foreign policy, right? So you're kind of like Canada and Australia under Great Britain, or Scotland under Great Britain, right? Well, the Puerto Rican rebel leaders, they accepted that. They accepted those terms, and the others didn't. So when we sent troops to Puerto Rico, right, we have quotes from President McKinley telling the generals, guys, I need you to improvise. We don't know if the Puerto Ricans are going to fight with us or against us, because they sure as heck haven't asked for our help, because they've made terms with Spain. But nevertheless, we sent men there, right? And as you know, we've never left. Puerto Rico is a strangely categorized island country that is an incorporated territory under us to this day. Not a state, right? But an incorporated territory under the United States jurisdiction. So we not only went there uninvited, but we've stayed there up to this day. So who is this guy, right? Who is this President McKinley? Very much an enigma of a man. And then in the Philippines, right? We left after 4 years in Cuba. And in the Philippines, we stayed there, and they devised a constitutional federal republic. And that ought to sound very familiar. That's what we have, right? At a place called Malolos in the Philippines. And the Katipunan organization organized this, and it literally was modeled after the American Constitution and our republic here. And McKinley rejected it and said that the Filipinos were not prepared for self-government, right? And he used both arguments, nature and nurture. He adhered to some of the so-called sciences of that time period, and that the Filipinos were not as evolved, literally, as human beings, and hence were more primitive people. But also by nurture, Spain had not given them a chance to engage in self-government, so they had no practice at it. So it was as if giving the keys to a car to a kid who had never been through driver's education and learned to drive yet. So with that type of arrogant, paternalistic talk, we told them at Malolos, no, don't be silly, guys. You're not ready for a government like that. So he claimed that he was going to institute some major changes in the Philippines. So for one, he kicked the Franciscan missionaries out. It's strange. The Franciscan missionaries had great reputations in some areas of the Spanish Empire, but not in the Philippines. Kind of like in New Mexico and early U.S. history, they were known for being very harsh toward the indigenous people in their area. So that was a popular thing for him to do. Schools were under the Franciscan Catholic leaders. He took that and made a public secular school system, and that seemed to have been popular amongst the Filipinos as well. They also had a specific position called, you don't need to know this, but they were called corregidores, and they could literally corregir or correct, right, city council's decisions. He got rid of that hated position, right? And so on the one hand, you see a little bit of this kind of white man's burden stuff, right? Where we're going to help the Filipinos have a better society. As I mentioned already, electricity and running water, sewage and sanitation, public school system. These changes we brought about in the Philippines. Nevertheless, we had an elected assembly that we allowed them to elect one another into, right? Filipino politicians. That there was a junta or committee above them as an upper house, and they were handpicked by the quote governor of the Philippines. The governor was handpicked by the president of the United States. The first governor was future President Taft, William Taft. So Taft comes in, he single-handedly writes a new constitution for the Philippines, and he single-handedly handpicks a council or upper house of the legislature, and they have veto power over the elected Filipino people, right? And then at the local level, they allowed them to have city councils, which they already had under the Spanish, but you had committees of 3 people in different regions of the different islands of the Philippines. And in those committee of 3, one person was an elected Filipino who was outnumbered by 2 handpicked Americans. So notice, right, this is not that great as far as democratic government, as far as self-rule for the Filipino people, because we claimed, of course, that they were not yet ready for it. And so again, who is this guy, this William McKinley guy, right? He was a bit of an enigma of a man. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so let's look at the study guide and see what we have and have not covered. So number 10 through 18, court history of the Spanish-American War, is that it stresses, again, the role of ideas that made our politicians and people feel as if compelled, right, to get more aggressive in foreign policy. You also had the role of yellow journalism. Make sure you read all of them, okay? No matter which ones you pick to write on for this week's assignment. Read all of them to study for test 2. Yellow journalism was sensationalist journalism. that oftentimes stretched the truth, exaggerated, sometimes outright lied to sell papers, or even worse, to have an agenda to try to convince the general population of the U.S. to get more aggressive in our foreign policy. So yellow journalism, it showed how awful the Spaniards were treating the Cubans. And it made a villain of a guy named Valeriano Weyler, who was issuing a reconcentracion program, where if you go into a region and he felt like there was a lot of sympathy for the rebels in this Cuban region, he would put them in a concentration camp. Okay. And so the press supposedly really was instrumental in getting a somewhat gullible public in America that was led by pathos and emotion to really cry out for help for the Cuban cause, for the Cuba Libre, free Cuba cause. All right. Then you also had congressmen who were reading the works of the intellectuals from number one, right? And we're also somewhat caught up in the yellow journalism. And also, we're going to get to it soon, may have had ulterior motives as well. And they put pressure upon the president also to get involved in the Spanish-American War. And so, yeah, that's something to think about. And remember also, another part of him being an enigma, a puzzle of a president, is what technically got us involved in the Spanish-American War was not the explosion of the Maine. The Spanish were repressing the Cubans, right, and arresting a lot of their members of the Cuban press who were trying to convince the public to fight in the Free Cuba cause, right? We sent the USS Maine outside the Havana harbor when a famous bullfighter came there in Havana from Spain, and it had a big international crowd there. The Cubans used that to give out pamphlets to all the people that were coming for the bullfight, to gain a sense of consciousness and empathy for the Free Cuba cause. And the Spanish cracked down on them, just shot into a crowd and killed some of the Cubans right there publicly in Havana, did mass arrest, shut down their newspapers, etc. And some of them were technically dual citizens, right? So McKinley, even though he claims, right, he didn't want to declare war, he didn't even want to get close to that. He didn't even want to recognize Cuba as a separate country because that would provoke Spain. So he continued to just call it a rebellion. But he sent the USS Maine in the harbor as a statement, right? Like, hey, the US's military might is close by, and you better be careful how you treat dual American citizens. And after about a month of being stationed there, it mysteriously blew up, and 260 something American sailors were killed in the explosion. And we had a team of scuba divers. Spain had a team of scuba divers. Of course, they came up with evidence that it was an accident of combustion, and we came up with evidence that it was from an external source, as if it were a mine that the Spaniards had placed in that harbor that had blown the ship up. So American public just was in an uproar, right? And when we did fight Spain, that was the popular slogan, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. But even then, right, the president said, I don't propose to be swept off my feet. I'm still not okay with asking Congress to declare war, even after the ship's explosion. And so, but what he does is he issues Spain an ultimatum and says, you have so many more weeks to either squash this rebellion or to come to terms in which, come to terms in which you and the Cubans agree. And my point on him being an enigma of a man is, if the Spaniards can't squash the rebellion that started in 1895 in 3 years, how are they going to squash the rebellion in 6 weeks, right? They should have known that was impossible. And then secondly, if the liberal government of Spain was already offering somewhat autonomy to the Cubans and the Filipinos and the Puerto Ricans, right? It was evident that that was as far as the Spanish government would go. If anything, it was a notion of prestige for Spain. It would have been political suicide for the prime minister and his party in parliament in Spain to just give up these islands as belonging to Mother Spain. So McKinley should have known that's as far as Spain could go in granting concessions. And it was very clear that under Antonio Maceo and the Cuban leaders of the rebellion, they would accept nothing short of complete independence. So my point being, right, is he arguably issued an ultimatum that he knew could not be met. So, he had to have known better that Spain was not going to meet that ultimatum. And sure enough, she didn't. And we declared at the end of that time that we gave Spain war. That was the official reason for entering the war. And also to show the complexity of the president, in some speeches to some people, he always just talked about the Cuban cause being like the American cause back during the 13 colonies war for independence against Great Britain, right? That American citizens were there, and it was we need to protect their rights and property. But then to other crowds, he would talk pure economics and say, we have $35 to $50 million invested in that island. That war in Cuba has been bad for American business, and we need it to stop so business can go on well as usual. Okay. And so that was his technical reason. So going to revisionist interpretations on number 11 is, for one, right, is that we were engaged in realpolitik, that we wanted. Remember, revisionist history revises the court romantic history. So with revisionist history, it says we were looking for a fight. We were eager to get involved because we wanted our hands in Cuba. We wanted our hands in the Philippines. We wanted our hands in Puerto Rico for geopolitical reasons. Okay. Secondly, with revisionist history, is they give the thesis of the Depression, that a lot of it was economics. We were still battling the Depression that had begun in 1893. Although we were somewhat getting out of it by 1898, we hadn't fully gotten out of it. And so some people think that the government was convinced that if we take these islands, right, even momentarily, we could dump our surplus industrial and farm goods into their markets, especially the Philippines, which is so heavily populated. And they could help us economically. It could help us economically, right? Also, in the revisionist history, so realpolitik and us being aggressive, a depression that we wanted to get out of. And in the midst of that depression is, remember, the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike of the 1890s. We had a lot of labor strife and a lot of drama between the different classes. So some people thought that a war would be a good distraction, right, from all the drama that we were facing from within. We had drama over the currency system, the poor and the borrowers, right, were wanting it to put us on the silver system, to print more money so that it would help them pay their debts more easily. But the creditors, representing the wealthy, they of course didn't want that. They wanted the cash supply to stay low because the value of the dollar would stay really strong. So when someone owed you $30,000, you wanted every penny, every bit of that worth of that $30,000, and not have it be inflated by the printing of more money. So we had drama like that, and some people thought this was a good distraction from our domestic strife to go and have a common enemy in Spain and fight them elsewhere. Okay. And then lastly, lobbyists, right? Remember, a lobbyist group is a faction that shares the same self-interest and or beliefs, and they lobby the federal government for a realization of their faction's goals, aims, desires. So hence, big businesses made a lot of money off this war through war contracts alone, being able to sell food, sell rifles and ammunition, sell uniforms to the soldiers to fight in this war. Not to mention, once we took over these island countries, even if temporarily, the government can help facilitate their investment in these islands and make good money off of it as well. So those are the revisionist interpretations. as to what triggered our participation in the war for independence. Okay. So let's see here. And number 12, Walter Lefebvre. I would highly recommend him if you're interested in reading independently on this subject. Walter Lefebvre has a lot of dirt on us. He's primarily a revisionist historian, kind of characterizes the United States as power hungry, but also almost suggests that we're a bit of a plutocracy. I remember plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy who have their hands in the government. And the whole idea is quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. That a lot of the senators were investors and shareholders in these big companies. And so hence they stood something to gain themselves. That what was good for the big corporations was good for them as senators, as private investors in these companies, etc. So you had a lot of cases, Lefebvre shows, demonstrates, where you had a, what's that expression where you have, oh darn it, I'm drawing a blank, but where you as a politician have a personal stake in it, right? There's an expression, and I'm sorry, it's eluding me right now, but that they had something to gain from it, right? And that's what I mean by number 12, is that you should see evidence in your handout of corporations lobbying the government so that they can build railroads through Nicaragua and Panama, so that they could grow sugar in Puerto Rico or in the Philippines, etc. And so you find evidence of our government being very, very attentive to the needs of business. Oh yeah, also I do a little bit in the handout on China and Korea, and show you evidence of some of our diplomats, right, literally writing down in primary sources that they were trying their best to help the interest of big business to be able to invest and sell their stuff in these countries. And they were willing to diplomatically bully these countries to allow big business those opportunities. Okay. So number 13, we've already done that. Beliefs at the end of the 1800s. That's number 1 on your handout. I've gone through that. Let's see here. And we've done 16. McKinley as a bit of an enigma, a puzzle. We've done that one. James G. Blaine, what I want you to get down is number 17. Is, to me, he's an example of kind of all the above. There's evidence that this guy, as Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison, that he genuinely believed in a lot of these beliefs that were circulating at that time, and felt like it was a necessity for the U.S. to become more aggressive. But he also was connected to big business. And so he also had an ulterior motive as well. And he was very much for America becoming an imperialist power. He was largely responsible for the Naval Appropriations Act of 1883, where we built a new steel navy that had first strike capability and could travel across the mighty Pacific Ocean and fight somewhere far away. Okay, so James G. Blaine to me represents kind of all those in one package. And then number 18, I kind of mentioned that already. The Platt Amendment is when we left Cuba in 1902, but we stated that we reserved the right to intervene in Cuba whenever we deem necessary. And largely, like I said, to protect American lives, liberty, or property, or to ensure stability, right? That there would be stability on that island, which was better for business. And so basically that really curtailed or cut short Cuba's independence. And not to mention Guantanamo Bay with a naval yard that we demanded against the will of the Cubans. That was known as the Platt Amendment on number 18. Okay. So going back up to what I have skipped, and that is numbers 14 and 15. While we're on the Spanish-American War, let's do 15 first. All right. So firstly, I want to just keep this general, okay? I'm trying to think from my previous test, because like I said, we could, especially with an instructor more well-read on the subject than he or she could spend days talking about this war alone. Trying to prioritize what were the main things I put onto a question. Give me just a moment. I apologize. Um, For one, poor Cuban decisions. I'm sorry, poor Spanish decisions. The Spanish did not use their numbers on the islands very well. They spread them out and never really concentrated them into certain areas because they didn't know where we were going to strike on the islands. And so oftentimes, even though the Spaniards outnumbered our soldiers almost without exception on these islands in this War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, we oftentimes were about equal in number, if not superior in number, in most of the major battles that we fought. It just happened that way. So the Spaniards made some poor decisions. One, for instance, right? They bottled themselves up in Santiago de Cuba, in the city of Santiago de Cuba in the Cuban island. And in this harbor, they, like I said, they bottled themselves up. And in this very compact harbor, we just sent a cordon. We did a semicircle of ships outside the harbor and just waited for them, right? And they basically bottled themselves of their own volition. And finally, under a guy named Cervera, Cervera, Admiral Cervera decided to try to run through our gauntlet, our cordon around that harbor. And we shot down in minutes every ship they had, and took Cervera as a prisoner of war. And it was very lopsided naval battle, as a lot of the naval battles were. So, and then just inside Santiago de Cuba, our men surrounded the city, our army men on land, and we had a guy whose name was Shafter, Shafter, and Colonel Shafter convinced the Spaniard there to surrender the city without a fight. He convinced them with all our artillery that it was inevitable that we were going to win, but that there was going to be a lot of blood shed. And so why not just avoid the bloodshed and get straight to the inevitable result of the Spanish losing that city? And so on the fourth try, it seemed like the fourth time was a charm. I don't know if it was Blanco. It wasn't Blanco. It was one of the other Spanish leaders decided to give the city up. When our men walked through the city, they could not believe how well protected it was, the artillery that the Spanish had, etc. It would have been very, very bloody, and we got lucky that we didn't have to fight in that city. So the Spanish, in hindsight, they made poor military decisions. They put all their men together at Manila in the Philippines and tried to take us on toe-to-toe in a naval battle. And they didn't have the pivot mechanism in their cannon. So their cannons could not move around. They only shot one area. So we came in on a side that neutralized those cannon, where the cannon immediately fired over our ships and were of no use and help to the Spanish. And we took Manila. They surrendered Manila in a single day of a naval battle. Our guy was Dewey, Commodore Dewey. So the Spanish made poor decisions in hindsight. Let's see here. Also, we were very paternalistic with the native rebel fighters. We just assumed that we would order them around and tell them to integrate into our units and fight with our units under our American commanders. And to the extent that the Filipino fighters, the Cuban fighters would not, we told them basically, you're on your own, then go and fight elsewhere. So we were very paternalistic with them. And so that this was clear, this was a fight between the US and Spain. And remember, Congress declared war largely under the rhetoric that we were helping these people gain their independence. But we certainly didn't come in as equal allies with them. and giving them decisions to make on the battlefield. So poor Spanish decisions are paternalism with the other countries. Also of note were the Buffalo Soldiers at a place called El Cañe, C-A-N with a squiggly thing over it, E-Y. At El Cañe, the Buffalo Soldiers lost a lot of men, and they didn't get the respect or the recognition at the time that they deserved. The Buffalo Soldiers were African-American units who had fought in the West in the quote Indian Wars, and the Native Americans began calling them Buffalo Soldiers, and the name stuck. And so, at any rate, with the Buffalo Soldiers, sometimes you see in history when a marginalized group like African Americans fights well in war, sometimes it helps them win respect and recognition that carries over after the war into giving them more participatory rights and opportunities and powers. But that did not happen in the Spanish-American War. Matter of fact, Teddy Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, future president, he surrendered. He resigned from his position so he could form the Rough Riders, a group of other wealthy guys like himself who were stockbrokers, lawyers, guys who went to Ivy League school, who were looking for an adventure and a patriotic fight in war. They fought semi-independently, but they were put under American commanders as a volunteer group. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to become very famous after the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba. And according to his own diary, he said the Buffalo Soldiers were sent up the hill first, and they incurred the highest casualties, and that they deserved more credit than the press and the country back at home was giving them as African-American soldiers. So that's another thing is from the war would spring the press's praise of Teddy Roosevelt himself, so that years later, actually very soon later, this was 1898, and he's going to run as vice presidential candidate in 1900. His president, McKinley, will be shot and killed in Buffalo, and he'll become president within a couple years. But he largely runs as a war hero as far as his campaign. And so from San Juan Hill. So poor Spanish decisions, paternalism of the U.S., Buffalo Soldiers not getting their due, Teddy Roosevelt coming out of this as a hero. And then, of course, we contended that we needed to fight the Spanish in Puerto Rico and in the Philippines as a military necessity, because remember, neither Puerto Rican rebels nor Filipino rebels invited us to help them. And then we're going to stay in both those islands, right? The archipelago of islands for the Philippines and the island of Puerto Rico. We're going to stay for years in those countries, uninvited. All right, I'll probably just keep it to that as far as military history of the Spanish-American War. And just in case I have it on there, it's what it's stated in the book is John Hay, the new Secretary of State under McKinley, he called this a splendid little war because casualties were so low, because the fighting was so quick. We won in just a few months, and it was decisive and easy, and because we gained these islands from beating Spain. And so hence the term splendid little war for the Spanish-American War of 1898. All right, so are there any questions? Let's see here, Eurizia Wenrostro. Let me make sure I get your name on here, so I give you credit as well, extra credit. And just in case it's on the test, I think I had it in the handout. So make sure you read the handout. Is remember also the nefarious way by which we gained the Panama Canal, because that was another thing, right? Instead of having to go all the way underneath South America, we wanted to travel through an isthmus. an area that's 3/4 surrounded by water, but has a narrow strip through land to get from one body of water to the next. In this case, either the Atlantic or the Caribbean, through Central America, Latin America, into the Pacific Ocean. We tried to get Colombia, which technically controlled present-day Panama, to grant us cessions to be able to build a canal through there. And Colombia said no. So then we helped, even before the days of the CIA, we helped arm and support a rebellion in Panama to break free from Colombia. And it was successful, but it was also successful because we brought in troops to protect the Panamanian rebels, really. But we claimed because there was a certain area where the Diamante, Los Angeles, La Luz, and Diamante mining corporations were down in Panama. And we contended that we were putting troops there to protect Americans' lives, liberty, and property in that region. And so hence the Colombians could not fight in that region lest they want to take on American Marines. So we very much manipulated and helped the Panamanian Revolution win. And of course, what's the first thing independent Panama did when they convened as a new Congress in a new country, independent of Colombia, is they granted us a right to build a canal. And so, you know, in hindsight, and even at that time period, that definitely looks like we got our hands bloody, we got our hands dirty to get that canal established. And of course, court history will show they overlook that, and they look to the engineering feats that were done with that canal. Supposedly, as an engineering perspective, it was quite a marvel for its time period. But a lot of Panamanian laborers died building it, of course. So we're going to issue that. And then also, let's see here, identification. I apologize, you guys. We have a couple more, 21 and 22. We've already done 21. So white man's burden, right? That's the idea that almost making a Christian perspective from social Darwinism and the ideas on number 1, saying that we'll go ahead and take over small island countries, but we will help them modernize. So we'll do it not only for our own enrichment, but for the good of the people in that island country as well, right? By catching them up to speed with things modern. So we've done 21. Number 22, Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, his amendment, his addition to the Monroe Doctrine. The original Monroe Doctrine of 1823, and this is the last one, guys, hang in there, stated European powers stay out of the American hemisphere. Stop bullying the Latin American countries beneath us. This is not your hemisphere, right? Well, his addition to the Monroe Doctrine, instead of being directed toward Latin Americans, was directed toward Europeans, was directed toward the Latin Americans themselves. And he says, Latin Americans, stop doing 2 things that are inviting the Europeans to come and take you over. Okay. And he says, because if you do either of these 2 things, we're going to beat the Europeans to the punch, and we're going to come in and clean house in your country. So now we're becoming the policeman, the dad to Latin America, with Teddy Roosevelt's highly paternalistic corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He said, for one, right, do not be financially irresponsible. What was happening is countries like France and Germany were lending money to these new Latin American countries, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, right, El Salvador, etc., Argentina. And the countries, for various reasons, began defaulting on those loans and not paying them back. So the European countries began sending in legations, these diplomats who said, okay, now we're going to help control your budget, and we're going to allocate to our bank a certain amount of your yearly revenue to ensure personally that you pay us back. And then sometimes they stepped it up even from there, where they would send troops and keep soldiers in these Latin American countries and practically behind the scenes run the government of these Latin American countries, at least ostensibly, until they got their money back. So Teddy Roosevelt said in his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was very paternalistic, Latin Americans, do not be financially irresponsible. Pay your loans back, or we're going to come in, take over your customs offices, and we're going to pay back in increments the European banks that you owe. Okay? So that they won't have an excuse to take you over. The second one, do not only not be financially irresponsible, but do not be politically unstable. Because oftentimes we don't have time to get into it. I don't want to take the time and bore you with it. And plus, I'm no expert in it. But for various reasons that we don't have time for, Latin American countries had a lot of political instability, scrap constitutions and new ones, coups, right, where the same system is intact, but one group militarily threatens or actually militarily defeats the leaders and takes over in their place. There were civil wars, coups, and scrapped constitutions galore in Latin America. And he said that was inviting the Europeans to get involved as well when they were politically unstable. So in the event of them being politically unstable, Teddy Roosevelt declared that American Marines would be sent into their country. They would be forced to have a general election and have a new government established. And they'd have to prove themselves in a certain number of months to be stable with this newly elected government. Then the U.S. would pull its troops out. So very paternalistic. We're becoming the policemen of the American hemisphere with Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So I hope that I explained that okay for you to get that one right on test 2. And that is finally it. Any questions? Rachel, Leah, Eurytia? All right. Good. Okay. All right. So it takes a good hour. I blabbed for so long. It takes a good hour for this to download and being able to put it online. But I will do that today and make sure this is put online. All right. You guys, good luck with your assignment. So just kind of business as usual, right? This overseas imperialism assignment and a quiz from the chapter quiz from the textbook on the same subject. And you guys have a nice week, okay? Just contact me via Canvas message if you have any questions or anything that I need to become privy to. And other than that, you guys take care, okay? I'm going to go ahead and you're very welcome. Thank you. I appreciate your connecting. Have a good day. All right. Bye-bye.